this integration and connection between the peninsula and the Ukrainian mainland is really key for us to understand, because so many seem to think that we can just make a deal with the Russian Federation, hand over Crimea as if the issue will go away. And Russians keep saying Krim nash, Crimea is ours. It speaks to this insecurity and this knowledge, frankly, that Crimea is not theirs.
Ukraine is blamed for cooperation with Hitler.
From an academic perspective, it ticks every box.
How about neo-Nazis in Ukraine, especially Unit Azov is blamed for that?
This notion of, a Ukraine for Ukrainians. For a lot of Western politicians and analysts, if they could sacrifice Ukraine to achieve that stability, they would.
The Black Days for the Crimean Tatar in 1944, what happened and how it changed Crimea forever?
If we go back to this question of this provocative who's Crimea that gets propounded in public discourse, particularly in Russia, we have to remember, first of all, the centuries of history in which Crimea was ruled by the Crimean Tatar Khanate from the 15th century until the late 18th century. And this was a Khanate that had dominion over the peninsula of Crimea that juts out into the Black Sea, but they also had dominion over the lands of what we now know as southern Ukraine. So the steppe lands of southern Ukraine. Actually, if one traces the current contact line between Russian forces and Ukrainian defenders, it traces more or less the upper boundaries, the most northern boundaries of the former Crimean Tatar Khanate. So when Catherine invades the Khanate in the 18th century many times, eventually absorbs it into the empire, she takes the peninsula, but she also takes these southern steppe lands of southern Ukraine. And the reason why they're taken is the interdependence of the peninsula with the Ukrainian mainland. And that's something that we need to understand very clearly, that the peninsula is a natural extension of the Ukrainian mainland. We have to remember that Crimea is not naturally connected to the lands of the Russian Federation, and that in terms of its resource infrastructure, the peninsula of Crimea is very warm and arid, so it's always relied on fresh water from Ukraine, resource flows from Ukraine. This integration and connection between the peninsula and the Ukrainian mainland is really key for us to understand, because so many seem to think that we can just make a deal with the Russian Federation, hand over Crimea as if the issue will go away. That's not tenable. And we can look at centuries of history of this interdependence between the peninsula and the mainland to see why. So in the 18th century, the Khanate is absorbed into the Russian Empire. And after the Crimean War of the 19th century, this is when Russian imperial expansion in the 19th century was faced down by British, Ottoman allies, and stopped that imperial expansion and saw a Russian defeat. That defeat, however, stopped expansion in the Black Sea region, but the Tsars were able to keep control of the Crimean Peninsula. But after that war, the Tsar decided to order what he called at the time an очищение, a cleansing of the Crimean Tatar people from the peninsula. So this desire on the part of Russian rulers to erase and destroy the stewards of the Crimean Peninsula for centuries has been a perennial objective of theirs. And it speaks to this uncertainty and insecurity on the part of Russian power vis-a-vis Crimea. The reason why many reply to the question, Che Krim with Krim nash, Crimea is ours, it's a rather desperate response to an uncertain situation, frankly. It looks confident, but the great scholar of empire, Edward Said, used to say that, if you really belong in a place, you don't need to keep saying it over and over and over again. So when Russians keep saying Krim nash, Crimea is ours, it speaks to this insecurity and this knowledge, frankly, that Crimea is not theirs. And in fact, into the 20th century, we can talk about this hopefully a little bit later too, this notion of a Russian Crimea was just, even in the words and in the views of Soviet authorities, was not a real thing at all. So that's what brings us to 1944, because we can only really understand Stalin's murderous deportation of the Crimean Tatars as part of a broader campaign to erase the indigenous people from the peninsula, and it started under the Tsars. Stalin sought to finish what the Tsars started. And that took place in May of 1944 over the series of 72 hours, in which Crimean Tatar families, mostly children, women, the elderly, because so many men were off fighting at the front still in 1944, were placed on cattle cars, stuffed into them with no water, no food for over 2 weeks. There were no toilets. People died en masse. Children died en masse. The NKVD agents threw their bodies out along the way, so families have no idea where their loved ones were buried. Sometimes the cattle cars would be decoupled along the way, so people who were families that were close to each other in one car at the start of their journey would then be separated and they would never see each other again. The Crimean Tatars were then placed in special settlement camps, which are basically concentration camps, for years, and they were not discussed or mentioned in the Soviet Union. And in fact, within months and years, the Soviet Union had erased all of these Crimean Tatar city names and village names. They sought to erase their history and identity completely. In fact, in 1967, they even tried to call the Crimean Tatars something else. They called them Tatars, formerly resident in Crimea. Now, the Tatars of today's Russian Federation, there's a place called Tatarstan, and the Crimean Tatars are different people, different historical trajectories. But the Soviet Union tried to effectively dilute the unique national history and specificity of the Crimean Tatars in the sea of Tatar culture more broadly. And that went on for decades across the 20th century. And amazingly, the Crimean Tatar national movement fought back. They were the most organized in the Soviet period. All dissidents learned from the Crimean Tatars. They said so. So any innovation of so-called inakodumsi or other thinkers, so-called dissidents, as we call them in the West, this is the term that a lot of so-called Soviet dissidents didn't like very much, but nonetheless, they learned from the Crimean Tatars, and that led to their ability to return in the late 1980s. So a story of a people exiled, subject to genocide, but a people who kept fighting through pacifist, nonviolent resistance and managed to go back to their homeland at the end of the Soviet period, which is a remarkable triumph. But we see now history, to an extent, repeating itself with a new kind of oppression of the Crimean Tatars, a new kind of deportation. So when we talk about the deportation of the Crimean Tatars today, unfortunately, we have a horrific new frame to place it in when we see peoples in occupied Ukraine being deported to far reaches of the Russian Federation, even as far as the Sea of Japan.
Especially children without
and
parents.
Children. And this is a shocking and infuriating, heartbreaking realization is how these children have been subject to such horror, being pulled from their families or being taken from families who've just been killed and presented with this view of the world that is twisted and frankly demented. And rightly, the international community has indicted Vladimir Putin for this crime, and hopefully he'll be indicted for many more.
Yeah, but it's just not just him. There's such thing as collective Putin. Those people who helping him or doing it behind his back or with his directions or instructions. During Soviet time, there was a politics and official when the former military officers were not allowed to, after they retired, were not allowed to settle in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and they were encouraged to go to Crimea to assimilate, and this is the steps which brought us to the Russian Crimea, or the Crimeans who hate Ukrainians or would like to be part of Russia. Would you agree? Because sometimes people in the comments write me, the Crimeans, they hate Ukraine, they hate Ukrainians, they don't want to be part of Ukraine. How would you reply on that?
Well, YouTube comments can be, let's say, intriguing, to put it kindly. Well, first of all, if one says the term Crimean, it's important to understand what do we mean by this term, right?
That's exactly we used the word in the comments. Crimeans.
Right, Crimeans, right. Well, let's take a step back again and ask ourselves, why do we have this view of a Russian Crimea? So I just laid out this history that really until the 20th century, if one looks at the demography of Crimea, for instance, and you look at the middle of the 19th century, 75 to 80% of the entire population of Crimea was Crimean Tatar. And because of that attempt by the Tsar to cleanse, and that's, again, the word he uses, so we often think of ethnic cleansing as a term that really evolves in the 20th century, but the Tsars were using it back in the 19th. That population drops to about 20-25% within a period of about 40 to 50 years. So that's done through deportations, displacements, murder. This takes place across the Ukrainian lands through various times in history. And we can talk about how they happen in eastern Ukraine a bit differently. But that leads us to 1944. And when the Crimean Tatars are expelled from the Crimean Peninsula, it leads to an economic collapse of Crimea. And this is something that Khrushchev notices in 1953. When he goes there, he's shocked by the poverty of Crimea. He's shocked by the way in which the peninsula has not rebounded since the Second World War. He sees this economic deprivation, and he encounters a lot of people who come over to him and say, we're settlers here. And they're not coming over with compliments to Khrushchev, they're coming over with complaints. And a lot of these complaints are, we were sent here, but we have no way of farming, we don't know how to farm. We are not, even though they've taken Crimean Tatar homes and Crimean Tatar property, and that's important for us to understand, is that when the Crimean Tatars were deported, roughly 200,000 people, all of their property, all of their land, all of their homes were redistributed to Soviet settlers. 60,000 Soviet settlers within the first 2 to 3 years after the deportation. So those people were not happy with the situation in Crimea in 1953, which leads Khrushchev to do a few things. One of them is to understand that Soviet Russia is not administering the peninsula effectively. We have ample documentation of Khrushchev's disappointment and many other members of the Politburo who are seeing the Russian Soviet elites not tending to Crimea well. And it makes sense because, again, Crimea is attached geostrategically, geographically, with mainland Ukraine. And so Khrushchev makes a very practical decision that by transferring the peninsula to Soviet Ukraine, he will see more administrative efficiency. And that's what develops, actually. So after 1954, some of the major infrastructural projects that lead to an image of Crimea as this kind of paradise on the Black Sea happen because of effective and efficient Soviet Ukrainian administration of the peninsula. We in the West sometimes think of this as some sort of gift from Khrushchev, right?
It's used in the narratives quite often.
Complete ahistorical, inaccurate way of thinking about it. It was like anything, anytime one makes a political transition, sometimes it'll have a coding that is ceremonial in some way. But the real need was to revive Crimea, and that's what happened. At that same time, in Soviet documentation, we have Soviet elites saying things like, their project is to, and the Russian is something like, «Сделать Крым новым Крымом со своим русским укладом». Something like, we're trying to make Crimea a new Crimea with its own Russian profile, its own Russian shape. And so what we see in comments like this is a certain understanding among Soviet elites themselves that this so-called Russian form on Crimea didn't exist. But now that the Crimean Tatars have been deported, now with all these settlers coming into Crimea, they can reshape it. And that's what they did. So Soviet Ukraine resurrected its economy, but the Soviet Union more broadly made it into this image of Soviet largesse and relaxation and beauty on the shores of the Black Sea. That was a project of disinformation and soft power. It involved many people, particularly military figures, as you mentioned before, settling there. And naturally, those that do settle there and are coming from a Russian military background have certain views that are, let's put it very plainly, chauvinistic vis-a-vis other Soviet peoples at this time. So we can get into nationalities policy in the Soviet Union if you like, Jenny, but that's a big issue.
Yeah.
But those Russians who settle in and around Sevastopol and across the peninsula have a certain view about Russian military power that's not too far from the view that we see today. And so naturally, it is not open to other nationalities and ethnicities. It had a very racist view to the Crimean Tatars, and one might even say to Ukrainians as well. And that led to a situation in the 1990s that became sensitive, but was largely resolved in 1996 with the introduction of Ukraine's constitution. Crimea becomes well integrated into the political structures in Ukraine. And really what happens in 2014 is a major surprise, and only really due to Russian intervention.
But what happened in 2014?
Well, there's, of course, the situation in Kyiv that we need to be aware of. So the so-called Maidan revolution, Euromaidan, the Revoluция Hidnosti, a revolution of dignity, takes place. Sometimes in the West, we hear about this term, the ouster of Viktor Yanukovych, as if somehow Viktor Yanukovych was jettisoned from his position as president of Ukraine by protesters who carried him out from office with pitchforks or something. It didn't happen. Yanukovych left seemingly of his own accord, and we see him leaving well before certain agreements are made with European intervention with the protesters. When he does leave, it opens up a space for the Russian Federation to say one clear thing about Ukraine, and that is that a coup has taken place, and their obligations under international law are null and void. So Dmitry Medvedev uses that within, I think, a day or two of Yanukovych disappearing. That then lets the Russian Federation push a narrative, particularly in the West, that some sort of fascist coup has taken place in Kyiv. Of course, nothing of the sort took place. It leads to great uncertainty in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine as well. The appetite for any kind of separatism in Crimea was minimal. So we have ample sociological data, studies and surveys in the run-up to 2013 that are quite significant with a large sample size. All of them show major and significant, overwhelming majoritarian support for this view, that Crimea should be a part of Ukraine, that Crimea is Ukraine. Those who were separatists, I mean, I'm coming from the United States, there are separatists and crackpots in nearly every state in the US. The existence of separatism doesn't mean there's a broad public appetite for it. Ukraine was really no different at this time, but it's through Russian asymmetric warfare and intervention that it happens in Crimea. In the West, I think we failed to see how violent it was. So it involved tanks barreling down and destroying walls.
The Green Man.
But often in the West, we showed on television the Green Man kind of standing quietly amid various residents of Crimea, appealing to them for some knowledge or guidance. But actually, behind the scenes, there were a lot of military objects destroying other Ukrainian military objects, so destroying the Belbek Air Force Base, under cover of night, using helicopters to storm Ukrainian barracks, to pull Ukrainian service personnel out, humiliating them, handcuffing them. It was a very violent takeover of Crimea. There's ample evidence of it on YouTube, for instance. Russian special forces celebrate these operations openly.
And then they received medals and all the awards, you name it. And they had the Crimea Days sometime in March.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important, I think it's the 20th or 21st of February, when these various awards and medals and coins are given to service personnel who served in this annexation operation that dated well before the events of March, when we started in the West paying close attention to what was taking place. So this was a hostile, violent seizure of the territory of a sovereign, independent country. This notion of self-determination, of a referendum, it's completely out of a disinformation handbook that should have been seen at the time here, and to an extent was by some, but because of the uncertainty and the lack of expertise of Ukraine and journalists on the ground in Ukraine who are part of different Western agencies, we had some people parachuting in from Moscow, for instance, but it's a big problem when people don't have a broader background to understand the broader nuance in a country like Ukraine, which is very complex. And we fail to see very clearly and speak clearly about this seizure of territory.
You know, there was such a big difference in 2014 and 2022 when there was full-scale invasion, because in the London newsroom, the stigma and against Ukraine and the trust to Russian officials, Russian media was so big. When there's like any news coming through, the editors would check first if it's true on the Russia Today websites. Oh, Russia Today says it's not true. Or Russia Today says different. This is how it is. And for me, that was very difficult as a Ukrainian to prove and to give the alternative view and explain it about propaganda. It took a while. In 2022, there was different. The British journalists in the newsroom, they were prepared. They knew their way around. But in 2014, it was hard work. It was almost impossible. And I remember we were doing at the BBC the documentary for BBC Panorama, and there was exactly the annexation of Crimea, the protesting meetings in Donetsk, where some women were calling for Putin to save the Russian speakers or Russian language, and I wasn't heard. I was trying to explain that Russian language feels good in Ukraine. It doesn't need anybody's protection.
And so many of these so-called protesters in places like Donetsk or Kharkiv were coming across the border from the Russian Federation. And so my friends, journalists in Kharkiv, for instance, used to do something very clever to understand where protesters, quote unquote, were coming from. They would ask protesters what time it is. And Russia is in a different time zone, 2 hours ahead of Ukraine. And often they'd see that these watches were showing 2 hours ahead of the time in Kharkiv. So you could see in ways that have been now, and I think this scholarly consensus has been slow to catch up with some of the best academic work about what took place in 2014 in both Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, that this was not some sort of local uprising of separatists. This was not it wasn't a civil war. This was Russia's aggressive intervention. There's a great book by Jakob Hauter called Russia's Overlooked Invasion that shows beyond any reasonable doubt just how explicit and directed these operations were in eastern Ukraine. And they operationalized and took advantage of our ignorance of the country and created enough confusion and generated enough noise for people not to listen closely to your voice. So the voices of people like colleagues Timila Tasheva, Ali Maliev in Crimea, who are part of a group called Crim SOS or Crimea SOS, that was trying their best to reach out to journalists in the West, to really give them on-the-ground information, to explain just how complex this was, that these people weren't local. Or if they were local, they were extremely marginal. Aksyonov, who's been basically at the helm in Crimea since 2014, was an extremely marginal figure in Crimean politics. His party won only a few votes out of hundreds available to it in the Crimean parliament. Yet, once you give some of these figures weapons and you create enough uncertainty, they can wreak havoc, and that's what they did.
Many compare Putin and Stalin. In your view, how similar and different they are?
Both have no regard for human life. Both have no respect for human life. Both have no qualms with killing their own people. Both effectively have very poor strategic vision. So it's worth remembering that Stalin makes an alliance with Nazi Germany between 1939 and 1941. This is a major act of collaboration with Nazi Germany. Were it not for that alliance with the Soviet Union, it's doubtful that Germany would have grown as strong as it did. And clearly, Hitler had a view of invading the Soviet Union at some point, and Stalin wasn't prepared for when it occurred. So during Operation Barbarossa, which was a disaster for the Soviet Union, it involved the Red Army deserting most of Ukraine, and not only deserting Ukraine, but destroying its infrastructure, destroying its supply lines, its dams, its geostrategic infrastructure, leaving people to their own devices, asking them to create a scorched earth with no political authority, leaving them to the whim of a violent occupier. So Stalin's strategic vision was extremely poor. I would say the same for Putin here. It's a major strategic error, this idea of trying to conquer Ukraine, seeing Ukraine as part of some sort of ancient historical space. It's complete absurdity. It's a fantasy that he has seen in his own life time and again proven false. There's a reason why in 2014, 2015, they have to use Russian regular forces to invade along the coast of the Azov Sea, because the Ukrainian forces were pushing against the Russian proxies. They were succeeding, and Russian forces had to come in and intervene. And so that effort stopped, and it stopped for a reason, because Ukrainian civil society is strong, Ukrainian identity is vibrant, it's complex and imperfect like all identities are, but it stopped that invasion. And this notion that after so many years in 2022 he could take all of Ukraine, it's nightmarishly stupid.
Ukraine was occupied by Nazi Germany, and till now, during this Russian war in Ukraine, Ukraine is blamed for cooperation with Hitler. Could you put this record straight? How relevant it is, and how meaningful or important, or why this narrative still here?
The why is very important here, Jenny. Yeah, the why. I mean, I think if we take a step back and talk about collaboration with Nazi Germany and collaborationism, and try to understand what we mean, first of all, by this. So if we are trying to understand the history of collaboration, and it's an extremely important topic, a very fraught topic that makes complicit so many peoples across Europe, it's very widely studied. But when we look at the case of Ukraine today and this issue that you've just pointed to, people bringing up Nazi collaboration vis-a-vis Ukrainians seemingly more often and more frequently than others, it points to, I think, a failure of our understanding of what collaboration was. So, of course, we have to start with the collaboration of countries of the Axis forces. So Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, obviously Italy, Vichy France, for instance. These were states that had massive resource that lent themselves to the German war effort that was destroying Europe and ravaging and murdering hundreds of thousands, millions of people. Vichy France, for instance, used French labor and participated in the deportation of the Jews in the Holocaust. So that's one area of collaboration that we tend not to talk about. Certainly we don't talk about collaboration of the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany. I just mentioned that. 2 years of really close cooperation, secret protocols in which they shared information, their security services were learning from each other. That's really significant, influential collaboration. Interestingly, what we tend to do now is if we're talking about collaboration, we talk about peoples, not states, but peoples who were under Nazi occupation. And before that, they were under Soviet occupation. And if we look at Ukraine, we have to remember that in 1941, 6 to 7 years before, it's believed an estimate of 4 million to 6 million Ukrainians were killed in the genocidal Holodomor, a man-made famine of 1932-33. So that's evidence of living under Soviet occupation that was clearly felt by so many Ukrainians across the country. And it's not for nothing that actually in 1934, the Soviet capital moves from Kharkiv to Kyiv. It's in many respects evidence that they felt the Ukrainian movement had been defeated enough that they could then place the capital, the Soviet capital, in Kyiv itself in 1934. So when the Soviet Union and Soviet Ukraine are invaded, the peoples there are abandoned by the Soviet regime. They're abandoned by the Red Army. They're meant to fend for themselves. So these are people without a state and its resources. They have no authority and control. So often, if we're looking at this as a problem of knowledge, why are we focusing on the collaboration of peoples with little power in Central Europe and avoiding the question of collaboration with states that were much more influential in driving the Germans to proceed with more aggression in Europe. That's a big intellectual problem. And I think to some degree, this focus on collaboration of Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Ukrainians, it's a way for us in the West to forget about the collaboration of states that was arguably much more influential. And this hyper-focus, of course, on those Ukrainians who, relatively speaking, were in the minority in assisting the German occupiers, is in many respects an ability on our side to forget local Western European collaboration and focus on those with little authority and agency and little voice in history. So it's important for us to remember that those who did collaborate, and they did, some did indeed volunteer to collaborate. Sometimes they believed in the ability of aligning themselves with Germany so as to win, finally, an independent Ukrainian state, to give their values a home, particularly vis-a-vis the horrors of Soviet occupation that they had experienced. And others were forced into these positions under occupation. But on the whole, they were a minority. The majority were fighting either in the Red Army, or Ukrainians were fighting in partisan movements. The same goes for the Crimean Tatars. The Crimean Tatars, in the vast majority, fought in the Red Army or for the partisan movements. Some, just like Russians, the Vlasov Russian liberation movement, had 10 divisions. It was thousands of people. The Russians have a history of collaboration there too that's even more organized in some respects than this rather fragmented Ukrainian experience. So that's a long-winded answer to say a lot of this discussion about collaboration in Ukraine is evidence of information warfare on the side of the Kremlin. It is disproportionate, and it is really fueling, as we've seen, this murderous genocidal aggression from the Russian side. So the moment they can say they're denazifying Ukraine, I mean, it's an absurd idea. But when one considers that they've been pushing this logic of Ukrainian collaborators, Latvian collaborators, etc., avoiding their own history of collaboration, both between 1939 and 41, the Vlasov Liberation Army, avoiding that completely, never discussing it. Because, of course, in large part, Soviet Russia wasn't occupied by Nazi forces. Those who were subject to the horrors of this totalitarian occupation were forced into positions of collaboration, but most somehow, amazingly, avoided it. And yet somehow we keep talking about it. So we need to understand that the reason why this question keeps getting asked is it's primarily driven by Russian informational warfare. That is taking advantage of our ignorance of Ukraine and the complexity of this history and fueling an ideology of genocidal, murderous, fascist aggression. And that's what it is. I mean, from an academic perspective, it ticks every box.
How about neo-Nazis in Ukraine? Especially Unit Azov is blamed for that because they are nationalist, as again, there's such a strong stigma, especially among Western journalists. I remember doing one or another documentary, and if in any case Azov a fighter or officer or the symbolics somewhere at the background, it's just people are terrified. They don't want to have anything to do with Azov because allegedly they are neo-Nazi. What would you say about that?
Well, first of all, we need to talk about why, again, these terms keep coming up and why it is that a name like Azov, or if we think about it differently, a name like Bandera, or before Bandera, a name like Petlura, or a name like Mazepa before Petlura, why these names, boogeymen, keep being used to frighten those Western observers who are trying to make sense of Ukraine today. It is, again, the influence of Russian information operations. We have to understand that, first of all. Now, as a purely historical matter, it's absolutely the case that the Azov battalion in 2014 had a very predominant membership among so-called ultranationalists or neo-Nazis. Whether that is in fact accurate is not quite clear. The big thing is these are extreme nationalists who have xenophobic ideas, who believe in the, let's say, cult of the leader. They were very much involved in forming this influential volunteer battalion. Part of the reason why they were made into this boogeyman figure is they were very effective in the military space. And after a while, however, once the chaos of 2014 could subside, the Ukrainian military absorbed the Azov battalion and it became a much more politically, ideologically diverse battalion. Its origins had a connection. That's absolutely true. But the Azov battalion today, just like any military, and I can tell you with some certainty about aspects to American, soldiers, and their ideologies are not always ones that celebrate liberal democracy. Let me put it that way. They're all over the place. We can find bad people with difficult ideologies anywhere we look. But in the case of Azov, the battalion changed, became much more diverse, and became subject to the command and control of the Ukrainian military, and no longer has that ideological component as central anymore. And so it's important for us to take, once again, into account the breadth of time, and to see that indeed something may have been the case in 2014 has changed radically in 2022, and to believe that the two are the same is just intellectually suspect in the extreme.
Azov fighters, they joke, and when you know Ukrainian history, it's difficult to risk not to be nationalistic or patriotic, because then you realize how much Ukraine was oppressed, and basically for the past at least 200 years was fighting all the time for survival. And it's a miracle to see that Ukraine as a nation still exists, comparing there being a battlefield between empires and having such vast territory.
That's important for us to mention here, because we often use the term nationalist, and in public discourse, nationalist usually means extreme nationalism. This xenophobic, exclusionary nationalism. The mainstream of Ukrainian nationalism is not that. The mainstream of Ukrainian nationalism is what we call civic nationalism. That is, the nationalism that believes that a community should have a state in which to offer their values, their aspirations, their dreams a home. So in the case of Ukrainian history over centuries, you're absolutely right. In the midst of all this colonial oppression, in the midst of language bans, forced displacements, genocidal aggression, murderous purges, the mainstream of Ukrainian nationalism has been civic nationalism. The notion that you can be Russian, Polish, Crimean Tatar, Hungarian, and become Ukrainian. That Ukrainian identity is ideational. It's a belief in this, I mentioned the term earlier, volya, a defiant freedom that had a lot of attachment to this question of the anti-serfdom movement, but also was highly anti-colonial. So Taras Shevchenko, we talked about him before, but he's a figure who's probably the most vociferous, most vocal anti-colonial poet of the 19th century. I would challenge anyone to find someone who does not condemn colonialist aggression more forcefully than he does. And yet, for him, the Ukrainian idea was one that you could adopt, no matter your background, no matter your language. And that has been the driving mainstream of Ukrainian national identity for centuries. On the extremes, on the margins, certainly, just like with any national identity, you're going to have people who take it to more exclusionary extremes. This notion of a Ukraine for Ukrainians, you'll get those communities, but they're marginal. And in the story that we often speak of Ukrainian nationalism and the Ukrainian national project in the West, we miss this remarkable story of a civic national movement founded on an idea of freedom that is opposed to aristocracy to the West and autocracy to the East, that is alive today, and obviously since the full-scale invasion has been driving Ukrainian national identity in the midst of a horrific invasion and active aggression. So we need to understand national identity and nationalism in a more sophisticated way, because it's certainly not the case that Ukrainian nationalists are full of these extremists. It's simply not the case at all.
What victory you imagine for Ukraine? Is there some attributes to the victory or something else, if you thought of it?
Well, I dream about it all the time. I can't not admit that. I think, though, those visions of victory have to be for Ukrainians, because they are those who are standing down this aggression and suffering through it, and also prevailing. However, it's important for us to say that in the West we often talk about Ukrainian resilience, and we celebrate that, and I get it, and it's a remarkable story, but we can't take it for granted, and we need to fight with Ukrainians to give them everything they need. And if we do that, if we're creative, if we're proactive, if we stop being constantly conservative and reacting and drip feeding support for Ukraine, I think we can achieve a victory that sees Ukraine's sovereign borders restored. It has to be said that there are some prominent voices out there, even among my colleagues in academic life, who are saying some irresponsible things about what it would take to get to that point of a victory that sees Ukraine restore its control over its sovereign, internationally recognized borders. I think it can be done. It can be done with giving Ukraine the weapons and the support it needs. It doesn't involve, as an esteemed professor, Jenny Klochko, has said, Ukrainian forces taking taking Moscow. It's a straw man argument completely. It can be done in a lot of different ways. We need to trust Ukrainian authorities and Ukrainian military, which have shown remarkable strategy, restraint, and vision. We need to trust, support them. And I think if we do that fully without constantly backing into these calculations of cost and benefits and escalation ladders, and we understand the chaos and the threat that Russia is posing to all of Europe, it's going to take us to be savvy and clever in response, to keep them on their toes. We need to fight a bit more like that and get ourselves on a mental war footing, to understand that none of us wanted any conflict with Russia. The main aspiration I saw when I first came here in 2008 was stability. And for a lot of Western politicians and analysts, if they could sacrifice Ukraine to achieve that stability, they would. But we've seen that all those attempts to appease Russia, to keep that stability, to keep making money with Russia, we see what that has done and what it's brought. And all it's brought is more aggression and more death to Europe, and we have to fight it. And the public has to be involved and understand the stakes of it too, because we don't want this war, but Russia does. And Russia's been talking about it, using that word, voyna, on state television every day, well before 2013-14. I mean, really, since the invasion of Georgia, this notion of a war with the West, a war with the United States, has been on the lips of a lot of Russian people for a very long time. That's the way they think. We need to face that unfortunate and horrible knowledge and realize we need to defend ourselves and stop imagining this is just going to go away.
Thank you. Thank you for watching. Today I was in Cambridge with Rory Finnin, and if you're interested in the subject of Crimea and Ukraine, please read the book. I did really enjoy it, and I still come back to it. And thank you very much for all your comments and like and shares and discussions we have in the comments. Please keep. I read all of the comments, and I try to reply you. And again, like, share, subscribe. Thank you.